Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Stratagems. My name is Ruben Ugarte, and this time we are doing something a little bit different. So far, in the first 5 episodes, we have covered companies, organizations, Sears, Polaroid, McKinsey, Boeing, the Hudson Bay Company. But I thought there might be a story here that could be a great fit for the ethos of the podcast, though perhaps it's not quite a company, and that is the story of Dubai. So I'm going to stretch the definition of organizations, not just to private companies or public companies, but to public organizations, governments. And I think that's going to open some interesting possibilities here because the Dubai story is fascinating. But of course, if we're expanding the definition, there's lots of other fascinating organization-like stories in the future that aren't quite companies. Dubai is a city today known for its tall buildings, the excess wealth that's not only unique to Dubai, but quite common in the region where oil wealth has been flowing for nearly 100 years. But the story of Dubai is also a little bit different because oil will play a role, but perhaps not the role you're thinking about, and definitely not the role I was thinking about before I did the research for this episode. Now, this episode will also be a little bit different in structure. In the first 5 episodes, I released the entire episode, some time between 2 and 3 hours long. I'm actually going to split this into 3 distinct episodes. And the lengths of each one will be, of course, much lower, perhaps closer to an hour or a little bit less, a little bit more. And they'll be released over 3 weeks. And I think this aligns well with the way the story is told. And I like the format. I think it might be a format to match for future episodes as well. I think it'll make the audios a little bit more accessible, perhaps a little bit less daunting. Then the final 4th week will just be the bonus content, which is one of my favorite portions of any episode. Highly recommend you check it out. So over the next 3 weeks, you're going to see 3 episodes. And then a final bonus episode for the Dubai series. We'll take a break, and then there'll be another episode in a similar structure. With that being said, let's jump into the first episode, part 1. And before we can talk about Dubai, we of course have to talk about the desert. Part 1. The desert. A man walks across the desert. His people have been doing this for thousands of years. Just themselves, their camels, a rifle in the modern era, looking for water, looking for an area where the camels can graze. These are the Bedouin. They're a nomadic tribe in the Arabian desert, and their history goes back at least to 6000 BCE. They say that there's few experiences more enchanting than spending a night in the desert. For the Bedouin, they spend a lot of nights within their tents, under starry skies, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by sand, as far as the eye can see. As you can imagine, the conditions in the desert are punishing during the day and much cooler at night. The sand can often be quite deep, up to your knees, and it may seem like you're walking in no real direction. But of course, for the Bedouin, they know the desert. They know where the wells are. They know where the small settlements are, the small congregations of people that have managed to sprung up in this harsh environment. The earliest Arab tribes emerge from the Bedouins, and their attributes are important to our story. The Bedouins aren't the only ones in this area, but they are perhaps one of the most distinctive groups. It is said that God's gift, or in this part of the world, of course, Allah's gift, to the Bedouin was the camel. Without it, there's no way the Bedouin could have thrived or survived in the desert. The camel provided transportation, milk, and occasionally meat. And the camels were dependent on their masters, the Bedouin, for finding the grazing grounds and assistance in mating. In the middle of the desert, the camel may be the most important possession a Bedouin has. In this area, up to perhaps early 1900s, outside of most locations, there are really no roads to speak of. So if you want to move between one point and a second point, you will likely do it by camel. And many of the people in the story are highly familiar with camels. They grew up with them, they know them, and in our story, they will exchange them for cars and other modern conveniences. But for the Bedouin, the camel is special. The camel also made it possible for the Bedouin to be able to explore a far broader range that could be deemed possible without it. You can walk with a camel, you can ride the camel to the different wells and make the desert seem a little bit more approachable. Camel's milk is so popular, so well known, that even into the 1990s in urban Dubai, people actually kept camels in the yard, some of them, not all of them, and they milked them. And you can still find camel's milk in many grocery stores. The Bedouin had their own rules for how to approach things. They took it as a right to be able to help themselves from any water from any well and any milk from any untended camels. However, if they approach untended camels or wells, they would typically slip off their safety catches on their rifles, just in case the other individuals may not feel the same way. The other people here in the desert are called the Hadar. These are typically the settled people. They live in towns and the gardens of the eastern mountain area and the oases. The oases are pretty interesting. Despite the appearance of the Arabian desert, there is water. They're actually in aquifers below the ground, not in the entire desert, but in certain parts. Over thousands of years, people found the different areas of these aquifers, and they would create wells where you can then take water from underground, above ground. And the location of these wells was typically passed on, initially perhaps just by word of mouth. Eventually, you might have maps that are able to show where the different locations are. And if you're planning a trip through the desert, you have to be highly aware of these locations and logistically plan around them. Otherwise, you may find yourself in a dry spot. In other areas, the water will actually bubble up on its own and create an oasis, which is effectively a small area of vegetation, mostly palm trees. And you can actually go online and find some pictures of this, but you can imagine just a desert, and right in the middle of it, or in this one spot, palm trees have sprung up, other vegetation has sprung up. You may even have maybe a small pond or a small lake. And the oases were areas where settlements could take place. Of course, these were rest areas in between long trips through the desert. And oases had to be tended and protected by people. You had to make sure that the water kept flowing, that trees perhaps didn't overgrow. So oases become this sanctuary in the middle of this tough environment. Now, the Bedouin and the Hadar had some friction between them. You can imagine they had different beliefs, right? For the Hadar, they were more focused perhaps on agriculture or on trading. If they were a port city, like of course we'll see Dubai be. And for the Bedouin, their nomadic lifestyle was most important. And these different values sometimes clash. The Bedouin will sometimes come into town, they would trade or they would buy something. Eventually, they would sort of get tired of it. It wasn't their environment. It wasn't the kind of life they wanted, and they would leave. So we're going to see this conflict keep going even into the 20th century as we pick up our story here for Dubai. The Arabian Desert is big. It's really as big as Alaska, California, and Texas combined. And it doesn't have a single river. There are places where the earth will crack open and you'll see gorges that can be as spectacular as the Grand Canyon. In others, the landscape is covered in this sort of peach-colored dunes that rise nearly as high as the Appalachians. And then, of course, you have the weather. Dry storms rage for days, sending gusts of sand scouring the earth for 1,000 miles. And of course, the Arabian summers are hot enough to kill healthy men. We have to make a note here, actually, that intriguingly enough, some of the weather in the desert and in Dubai is changing in recent years as, of course, climate change continues to change. But nonetheless, the conditions are still very tough. So to wander into the desert requires a high level of confidence, and perhaps we might even say bravery. Now, the water underground was a sweet kind. It was a sweet water that would be taken out in wells. Really, for a few exceptions, every drop really needed to be hauled manually from hand-dug wells. And if you were to look at a map of the desert region, the most you might see are actually just these wells, the names of these wells and the locations. Otherwise, it's just sand after sand and more sand. And of course, if you arrived at this location, it might actually be blocked off by sand, of course, that was blown over it, and you had to clear before. And the clearing of the sand may be treacherous. Now, other parts in the area actually obtain water not just only from wells, but from this system of ducts. The name here is phalanges, and it would take water into the settlements. And of course, in other areas, as we'll see, they'll start to remove the salt from the salt water to make it drinkable. And in other places, they might drink what might be called brackish water, which is water that is not quite sweet. It still has a little bit of salt, but the salt is not so overwhelming that you can drink it. I'm sure you're thinking that brackish water does not sound tasty, and it's not. But in cases where you have no water, you might as well drink a little bit of salt rather than none. Now, there are no frontiers in this area. If you look at it from the perspective of the Bedouins, of course, borders make no sense, right? You walk where you need to walk. You walk towards the well that you need to reach, and the concept of borders is foreign. This is going to be important because, as you can imagine in our story, oil is going to make an appearance. And when it comes to oil, borders are incredibly important. Every square inch matters. And it could be the difference between millions of dollars and nothing. But for the Bedouin, and really for the Hadar at this time, frontiers and borders are non-existent. There are no roads, as we mentioned before. There may be areas where the sand is packed a little tighter, so it's a little easier to walk, but not roads in the sense of we might think about them today. There's no electricity. There's no telephones. Many of the things that you might be expected to see by this point in the story, and we're in the mid-1800s into the early 1900s, are not here. Most homes were made of a palm front thatch. They basically were made from the palm tree. And they were this thing called wind towers, which supplied what was the equivalent of air conditioning, which is really just cooler air for the houses, primarily the sheiks and the merchants. Not everyone had this. These homes that were built of the palm tree perhaps had no windows. They were quite basic, as you can imagine. They were hot. They were small. But they protected you, at least from the elements, in some way. Cars are going to start to arrive by the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, but without roads, driving cars is going to be very difficult. Cars will break down. They'll get stuck. And it'll be a very common occurrence to jump into a car and then have to get out to push it because it got stuck in the sand. And no one is exempt from this. You'll even see the sheiks themselves, the tribal rulers, having to do this well into the early 1900s. So for the time being, if you want the most reliable way of transportation in this area, the camel is the way to go. There was no need for clocks. The only divisions of the day which matter to the people here, were the Bedouin or the Hadar, were really the times for prayer. And these are determined by the position of the sand. For those who may not be familiar with Islam, there are 5 prayers. The first one happens before sunrise. The second one happens after the sun passes its highest point. The third, before sunset. The fourth, right after sunset. And the fifth, when night becomes dark. The people in this area were highly religious. Faith was absolute. And it makes sense. In such a tough environment, in such tough conditions, there has to be something that gives you belief that you can make it another day, that you can continue living here for the rest of your life and for the multiple generations that come after you. Once you left the little towns and villages where the Hadar live, by the mid-1800s, early 1900s, you really needed some kind of weapon. You rarely met a man who was not armed with a dagger and a rifle and ammunition. And even in town, people may not have felt completely secure without their weapons. Raids, abductions were commonplace. And in a world where there is no rule of law, legal system yet, everyone had to protect themselves in some shape or form. Fishing, the rearing of camels and goats, and the cultivation of the date palm really constituted virtually the only indigenous sources of food in this area. The pearl trade, these were individuals who dive into the water to find pearls. And any kind of related maritime trade provided some means to buy other things and to import other goods, most notably stuff like rice, flour, sugar, coffee, and ghee, clarified butter. But the economy here is simple. It's a few items, it's a few needs, and for most of the people in the area, this is a hand-to-mouth existence. Whatever you grow or buy, you're going to eat right away. Now, there's a lack of material comfort, as you can imagine, and there tended to be a sense of fatalistic way of viewing the world. No reference could be made to the future without the reservation, inshallah, if God wills. God, and not the host, was thanked for the food. So this undercurrent of a strong religious faith built on Islam is going to be important because we're going to see a culture that's going to transform so rapidly that these foundations will be challenged. So we see a people that are molded by their proximity to the sea, the desert, and of course, any of those small green gardens, oases that contrast so vividly with the arid land around them. And their lives are molded by these factors, what they expect, how they see life, how they see possibilities, how they see the future. There's a fantastic book that I found in my research by an author called Ronald Codray, who calls it the Seven Shiktims. And they're mostly photos, actually, that he took, I want to say in the 1950s, 1960s, shortly before a lot of the area here is going to change very rapidly because of oil. And he describes his portraits of the rulers and the Bedouin and the seafarers and the merchants as people who faces portray the hardship of their lives, but a determined expression of people who accept their faith and their challenge and who feel they have a direct communion with a God whom they have entrusted their destinies. So while the conditions may seem difficult, especially to us, who live in modernity by far and large, to them, perhaps it's just the way life is. It was what God provided them, and they need to make the most of it. Now, the area in question would be categorized today as a poor area, as an area of poverty. One thing that came up to me, as I was doing the podcast, is that poverty is clearly relative. If you've never seen alternatives, you may not fully believe you live in poverty. You may, of course, grasp that some things are difficult, finding food, finding water. But if you've never seen roads and cars and a metropolis, you might not fully understand it. And it's important to note because this area, especially mid-1800s, early 1900s, is quite disconnected from the rest of the world. There really isn't that much relationship between here and what's going on in the European cities or what's going on in the American cities that are being built up. But here's some of the things that were quite common in this area, right? That, people really didn't have shoes. They primarily walked barefoot. Shoes, of course, would have been useless in any case. The sand was often knee deep and very difficult to navigate. So if you wore shoes, you would likely lose your shoes deep into the sand. Even when cars arrived, roads didn't really catch up. And many people have very vivid memories of seeing those first saloon cars, those very big cars that were starting to become common in other parts of the world. But the memories were not so much about the cars being driven, but being pushed to get stuck out of the sand. And again, whether you were the ruler or just a merchant, you were likely doing this if you had a car. For children, they had to be very imaginative when it came to how to pass time. They didn't really have sports to speak of. They would run, they would play tug of war, they would jump. They would kind of organize little games. They might sort of race down the sand dunes. They play marbles or jacks or spinning tops, or perhaps just swimming and playing in the beach. Schools are starting to appear in the area, but the general drive to learn how to read and write is quite low. For children, the main purpose of learning how to read and write was actually to read the Quran. That was sort of the goal here. And it was that if you could read the Quran, then you had perhaps a higher standing in society. But we're not thinking about going to school to learn other skills or, let alone learn some kind of trade or university. That doesn't quite exist here yet. The pants, known as kanduras here, many of them, they actually did not even have pockets, simply because there was really not much to put into them. As we get into the 1900s, the areas will develop in different timelines. And of course, there'll be some awareness of what might be going on. And, you'll hear stories of people who perhaps traveled to London. And there's this shock of just the vast difference of conditions. To go to a place like London and see that every place has electricity, and there's roads, and there's indoor plumbing, and there's modern appliances, and people have shoes. Even for some of the people here, you just trying to sort of put yourself in that headspace, right? They might go to a place like a European city and realize that there's no sand at all. They're not surrounded by sand. Places where you have entire parks full of grass, that there's freshwater rivers that flow all year long, or even buildings that are simply taller than anything you have ever seen in your life. This is the gap that's starting to appear here between the people who are living in this area, in this part of the Arabian desert, and what may be going on in the rest of the world. Now, our story is primarily focused on an area that by this point in time is called the Trucial States. It will become, in 1971, the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, and of course Dubai is part of the UAE. Now, the area is roughly made up of two zones. There's an eastern mountain zone and a western desert zone. And many of the cities that we, of course, are going to see and hear about today, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, and so on, are typically closer to the coast, and they function in some ways as port cities. Now, in the area, the British are paramount. The British at the time, of course, have supremacy through their navy, and the trade routes near the Trucial States are important to the British. In fact, they're so important that they will intervene often in any kind of war that may disrupt the trade routes. They were primarily concerned with piracy that was taking place off the coast of the Trucial States. And over many years, they would try to create peace and truces. Eventually, there were agreements being adopted between the British and the tribal rulers of each of the areas. There are 7 areas that we're concerned with in particular. And this truce between the British and the 7 areas will eventually become permanent, and it'll be known as the Perpetual Truce. And thus, to the British at least, these 7 areas of what's going to become the UAE were known as the Trucial States before the formation of the sort of official nation that we know of today. Of course, you got to remember that to the people themselves, the Bedouin, the Hadar, and the tribal rulers, they most likely did not recognize this name of the Trucial States. But for our purposes, we'll use it as a placeholder. Now, the British generally did not want to involve themselves in the day-to-day running of these areas. They let the tribal rulers run it as they saw fit. They also did not do that much to help them. The British are going to leave in 1971, and the progression in terms of infrastructure and just general development will not be as high as you might expect. It seems like really for the British, as long as there was no piracy and the trade routes could continue without any issues, they did not primarily care what was going on the ground. This is, of course, going to be good and bad. Perhaps it might be good because there's perhaps little involvement in terms of running a local government compared to what might be happening in India nearby. But of course, it's bad because when these countries need help as they come across oil wealth, then the British may not be as helpful as you might expect. Now, the separate areas, the seven sheikdoms, or emiratis, as each region is called, typically was ruled by a single ruler, perhaps an emir, a tribal ruler, who was the sort of commander or prince. And each region sort of organized itself around this person. Now, the power of this person was not completely absolute. And if you left the small towns and settlements, their power, of course, diminishes quite a bit. And for someone like the Bedouin, once you're out deep in the desert, the only person you might look up to might be God, and not so much the tribal ruler. Now, the seven regions or sheikdoms that are going to form the UAE in 1971 are, of course, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, and Ras Al Khaimah, and Fujairah. These seven regions are under British influence. It is not quite a British protectorate compared to what maybe was taking place in Palestine, modern-day Israel. But the British influence is absolute here, right? The British are going to prevent any other empire, primarily the Americans and the French, from having any kind of connections or relations with these seven regions. Now, Britain was really paramount in the Middle East during this time, unchallenged by any power of equal magnitude. I think perhaps the last challenge to British supremacy in Europe, not so much in the Middle East, was Napoleon. But by the 1800s, going to the 1900s, the British are truly on top of the world. This supremacy is going to endure until the end of the Second World War, but some might argue that it really endured for much longer in the imaginations of the people who live here in the Middle East. The shadow of power is long and remains after the substance has gone. A fantastic quote from Rosemer in this book called The Origins of the UAE. Now, the truce that the British Empire secured with the seven regions was crucial in one sense. It provided stability in the area. These regions were often at odds. And one can argue that this truce and this stability, this maybe like cocoon that the British have created here in the Middle East, is going to allow many of these nations to develop into the nation that we know today. Not so much because the British had a direct hand in it, but just because they perhaps kept outside pressure and influences from coming in. Not just European. We're going to see other nations in the area, Iran, Saudi Arabia, who perhaps are curious about what the UAE has, and they may be intrigued about what it would take to annex or take control of this region. But just to show, how perhaps little the British did besides this protection of security, when the British left in 1971, illiteracy was still above 70%. Life expectancy wasn't more than about 50 years, and there really wasn't a single university in the area yet. Some areas are going to develop much faster. Dubai, who is the focus of our story, is one of those areas. But this region is still going to be marked in poverty for a long time, and definitely for the most part of our story. But let's switch gears a little bit and dive deeper into one of the seven regions and the focus of our story, and that is Dubai, a sleepy village on the coast. Part 2. The Sleepy Village. Dubai is situated on the Persian Gulf coast and is roughly at sea level. It shares a border with Abu Dhabi in the south and Sharjah in the northeast, and the Sultanate of Oman, today probably just Oman, in the southeast. From your huts, you could likely hear the waves as they hit the coast, the calming nature of the water, and the reminder that you're surrounded not just simply by desert on one side, but you're also surrounded by water. The water, of course, is quite salty. It may not seem that appealing, but these are the seeds from which a port is going to be built. Perhaps one of the most successful entreports in history, on par with the entreports of the past, Venice, Amsterdam, and others. Dubai has no natural river bodies, oases, but it does have an inlet. It's just an entrance of water. If you've seen a map of Dubai, if you actually Google it, you see this bit of entrance of water. Then the inlet eventually reaches dead end. And this inlet is going to become important because this is going to be one of the key features that's going to allow Dubai to expand its port and allow ships to go deeper into the city and be able to drop off goods and, of course, pick up goods. This inlet is typically referred to as Dubai Creek. And at this point in the story, in the early 1900s, it's not really deep enough for large vessels to pass through. So you're primarily seeing small boats sail through it. There's a vast sea of dunes that covers much of the southern Dubai. And of course, past these dunes, you lead into an area in the desert known as the Empty Quarter. I gotta tell you, that sounds a little ominous if you're gonna find yourself in that area. Summers in Dubai are extremely hot. They are prolonged, they're windy, they're humid. There's an average high of around 40 degrees. That's 104 Fahrenheit. And overnight lows to around 30 degrees or 86 Fahrenheit. This is all in the hottest month of August. Most days are sunny. Winters are mild to warm with an average high of 24 degrees, 75 Fahrenheit, or an overnight low of 14 degrees, 57 Fahrenheit in January, which is the coolest month. The summers in Dubai are also known for a very high humidity level, which can make it very uncomfortable. And the highest recorded temperature in Dubai is 49 degrees or 120 Fahrenheit. The annual precipitation in Dubai is 79 millimeters. But this precipitation, intriguingly, has been increasing in the last few decades. And it's closer to about 110 in recent years. And actually, in April 2024, there was flooding in Dubai. So the conditions may be quite different in about 100 years in Dubai. Nonetheless, it's still a very hot city, very dry. And this is important because this is a location where we're going to see massive construction take place. Trying to construct this huge buildings, typically in the middle of this very hot summers. Since 1833, Dubai has been ruled by the Al Maktoum family, right? These are the tribal rulers of this region. It's an absolute monarchy. And the Al Maktoums are going to have several people in our story. The one in particular is going to be the focus of our story. This is Rashid, who's going to take over in 1958. The other regions, the other 6 regions, also typically have a ruling family, and then the power is passed on from father to son, or perhaps someone else within the family. Dubai has often been called the Venice of the Gulf. The White Creek, the Dubai Creek we mentioned before, separates the town into 2 halves. And Dubai really is an entreport of the traditional Arab type, like the fabulous Hormuz in past centuries. The comparison to Venice is intriguing. There's references that Dubai, like Venice, lack natural resources, but is going to grow very wealthy and sort of studded with palaces and this sort of cutting-edge architectural icons like Venice did. They're both going to leverage duty-free trade, and they're going to lure investment in the smartest minds from the surrounding regions. Tax-free in particular is something that Dubai has used a lot throughout the years, really reducing taxes and attracting other individuals from neighboring countries to come in and do business in Dubai. And even from perhaps a culture perspective, Dubai, like the old Venice, is an island of enlightenment in a sea of religious conservatism. And Dubai today sort of gets excoriated by more Islamic hardliners for catering to Christians, or at least allowing Christians in the area. And of course, what can almost be described as a hedonistic lifestyle, which we're going to see Dubai adopt as time goes on. That being said, of course, Dubai is going to charter its own path. There might be similarities between these 2 cities, these 2 entreports, but Dubai is going to take its own attributes and make the most out of them. Now, the Sleepy Village is going to start to wake up in the early 1900s. Its neighbor, Iran, will pass several measures to increase taxes for the merchants who operate out of the ports in Iran. In particular, there's a port called Linga where merchants would reject these higher taxes that are being imposed by the Iranian government. Iran and Dubai are actually quite close. If you can imagine something like a Miami and Havana in Cuba, there's something similar going on here. So they're just sort of across the water. And many of these Iranian merchants are going to leave Iran and migrate to Dubai because Dubai is offering duty-free and in many cases tax-free incentives to move their businesses over. And for the Iranian merchants, the moving over may appear and it will be really quite pragmatic. They can still do business with the rest of Iran and perhaps even expand their business to other parts of the Middle East. Iranians are going to bring a certain level of prosperity and progress to a town that really had known little of either. Most people in Dubai still lived in those sort of palm tree huts. They gathered the water out of the communal well. But now, the Iranians are going to start to build certain parts of the town. And it's going to be a modern quarter, in particular, called Bastakia. And in this area, we're going to see a lot of these Iranian merchants settle. Iran is more prosperous than Dubai at this point in time. Iran has not found oil yet, but they will. And the prosperity in Dubai is, at this point in time, in the early 1900s, is really based squarely on the trade with Iran. And the legacy of this initial seeds are still apparent today. You might still see a high level of Farsi in the area, and Dubai merchants really feel totally at home doing business with Iranians. So from the early 1900s onwards, Dubai is going to become the main entreport in the Persian Gulf, driven by Iranians, and of course driven by the own efforts within Dubai. And commerce is going to start to play a significant role and really the main source of revenue for the region. And the merchants in Dubai are also going to play a big role in the political development of Dubai. Right? Remember that Dubai is ruled by a tribal ruler, but now we have a new class of individuals who have access to some level of wealth, some level of revenue, and that wealth is becoming quite important for the region itself. So these merchants are going to play a key role in restructuring the economy and some of the government decision-making in this sort of pre-oil era of Dubai. This also means that Dubai is going to start to develop much quicker than its neighbors. The particular neighbor that we're going to see come up over and over again is Abu Dhabi. And Abu Dhabi's development is going to be perhaps maybe 50 years behind Dubai's. So while Dubai is starting to implement municipal governments and is going to bring in some form of indoor plumbing and eventually electricity and roads, Abu Dhabi will be quite behind for some time. They don't seem to be able to keep up with Dubai, and oil is not going to arrive in Abu Dhabi until much later on, 1958. So some of the stories you might hear of Abu Dhabi, and there's a fantastic book in the show notes called From Rags to Riches, are just quite incredible. People living in Abu Dhabi are still living in sort of very primitive structures without any of the modern conveniences, even into the 1940s and 1950s. But Dubai is going to change, right? Now, the other regions in the Emiratis are going to be much more similar to Abu Dhabi than Dubai. But we have to note this because while oil hasn't arrived in Dubai yet, Dubai is starting to pull itself up as best as it can. And it's seeing this entreport idea as perhaps the way to escape the chains that are preventing them from reaching some level of prosperity, from reaching some level of stability and modernity that has arrived in other parts of the world much earlier. However, this initial progress, this drive to become an entreport, and the ideas, such as bringing the Iranian merchants over with tax-free incentives, are going to come to a halt in the 1920s as a perfect storm of difficulties is going to hit Dubai. Part 3. The collapse. The port and piers in Dubai are lively scenes. You can hear the children running who are going perhaps to swim in the water. There's people just hanging out. And of course, there's merchants, right? Dubai being an entreport, this is one of the busiest parts in the city. Merchants coming in, they're going out. Ships are taking all kinds of goods. But there's one good we have to talk about, and those are pearls. Pearls have been treasured and traded as beautiful adornments for the wealthy for centuries by this point. And until the 1950s, the Gulf was one of the most prolific pearl-producing areas in the world. In fact, it was pearls which initially attracted the Portuguese to invade the area in the early 16th century, and then Indian merchants from the 17th century onwards. Pearls, of course, are found inside oysters, and they are sort of created by the oyster as they secrete a special chemical that then creates this hardened bowl-like shape item, and then this item may be shaped and sanded into a nice round bowl, typically what we see with pearls. The pearl industry was taking place all over the Gulf, in multiple regions in what's going to become the modern-day UAE. And for Dubai, the pearl industry was also one of the primary industries in the area. Now, this industry affected almost the entire town. You know, the way this industry works is individual people might take out loans that are going to be used to hire people and the materials on the boat to then go out into the water and then dive, free dive, to be more specifically. That is, you're diving without any equipment to go find these oysters that hopefully have pearls inside of them. And we have thousands of people doing this every season. So there's this entire influx of cash that's needed to sort of get going, get everyone hired. And then if the industry goes well, if the season goes well, then you come back, you have a bunch of pearls, those are sold, traded, there's money received, and then everyone gets paid, loans get paid, and whoever's sort of running that specific ship then gets to keep a little bit of profit, hopefully. That money, of course, would then flow back into the town, into the bazaars, and the other people who may have other goods in the area itself. Pearl diving was very tough, and it really took a toll of men's health. I think it's primarily men who were doing this. They were occasionally attacked by sharks in the area, and even jellyfish. There's actually pictures online you can find of people who have to wear this special suits. They're not really wetsuits or dry suits. It's almost like like you're wearing clothes, and they are meant to protect you from the jellyfish stings. When you were out in the boats, you of course have to deal with storms, perhaps in the Indian Ocean, and these were mostly small ships. So again, this is a difficult industry and trade, but one that is essential to the entreport business of Dubai. The importance of pearls is really quite up there, with palm trees, dates. In fact, when the first stamps were issued for the Trucial States in 1959, they depicted pearls, the local sailing craft, and date trees. Perhaps the three most important strands, apart from the camels, in the traditional economy here of the area, and of course of Dubai. By the early 1900s, pearls commanded 95% of the Gulf economy and supported 1,200 boats, each with a crew of about 15 to 80 sailors. And a quarter of those boats sailed from Dubai. Pearl merchants grew quite wealthy, and in some cases, much more wealthier than the ruling sheiks, the tribal rulers. They were building mansions, at least, mansions by the standards of the time and the era and the location of which we're describing. And many of these mansions had multiple wind towers, which is, what I mentioned before, that would bring cool air into a room. And it started to create a bit of a wealth imbalance between the tribal rulers and this sort of growing class of merchants based on the pearl industry. In Sharjah in 1888, pearl merchants actually overturned the ruling sheikh, and they replaced them with a favorite of the merchant class. So for the tribal rulers, they are wary of the pearl industry. In a way, it's an ongoing conflict that we're going to see play out in many different ways in our story. The pearl industry provides some level of revenue in an area where there isn't really that much. But then you have this growing class of individuals who seem to have a lot of wealth and increasingly a lot of influence with the people that you're supposed to be ruling over. Dubai, as it kind of grows from this sleepy village to an entreport, is of course highly dependent on the pearl industry. This is the thing that's sort of keeping the ports active. But there were other areas in the Gulf that were just simply dangerously dependent on a single export. What today we might argue to be an expendable luxury item. So Dubai is climbing itself out of the past and trying to go into the future, to modernize, and to do it through this entreport strategy. And the pearls are crucial in this. However, in the late 1920s, this entire house of cards is going to collapse. In 1920, the New York Stock Exchange is going to crash, and America, then Europe, and then other parts of the world are going to spiral into the Great Depression. When life got hard in the West, it became brutal in Dubai. The economy had been built, the strategy had been built on a capricious ornament that had no real practical value. And when times get tough, luxuries like pearls are really the first thing that people stop buying. Another development that will go on to undercut the pearl industry was the introduction of culture pearls. Now, culture and pearls had been tried for many years, and it typically worked by inserting a speck of grit into the oyster and then allowing the animal to cover it with secretions, this sort of special mixture that the oyster secretes. Then this speck will harden into something that resembles pearls, right? And then the pearls may be sanded down into the bowl shape that we're familiar with. Culture and pearls produced some results. Typically, they were known as blister pearls for a long time, and these pearls could really only be used on rings or on mountains where only really half a pearl would do. But then around this time, Japanese researchers discover a way to culture pearls slightly differently and actually have the oyster produce a much larger pearl, quite comparable to the kind of pearls you might find if you're diving deep into the water. So as the stock market crashes, as the Great Depression rises, culture pearls flood the market. And Dubai sprawls on its back like a turtle, and its development that's been trying to push so hard since the early 1900s, since that initial push to welcome Iranian merchants, comes to a screeching halt. One thing to note is that culture pearls are really quite popular. Even today, about 95% of the pearls available are typically culture pearls. So there's a wide acceptance of them and really a preference in the market for them. I'm sure, there's some people who might prefer the pearls you might find when you go diving. But generally, culture pearls were not seen as some alternative that was less of, but a reasonable equivalent. And as you can imagine, culture and pearls in some kind of laboratory cost much less than the entire orchestration of boats and sailors and diving and everything else. This industry is going to be decimated. And by the late 1940s, the thousands of boats that have been engaged in this industry are going to dwindle to really a relatively few. So from the early 1930s, this is going to be a continual decline in fundamental element of the economies of the regions, including Dubai's. And the market for natural pearls, the kind of pearls you might find when you dive in, is never really going to recover after the Second World War. The dive, as sometimes it gets referred to in the region, still maintains an important part in the memory of people who live here, right? A time where they dove deep into the water without any equipment and looked for these pearls. So this is going to go from being a pragmatic driver of the economy to a cultural memory of what the society looked like before a certain time. So from the late 1920s into really the 40s into the early 50s, where we're going to pick up our story next, this is going to be very difficult years for Dubai. Its entreport strategy is in shambles. Its main industry, the pearls, are decimated. The economy itself is not doing well, not just in Dubai, of course, just, all over the world with the Great Depression. And Dubai is particularly tough. And then in the late 1930s, we're going to see World War II appear, which from the perspective of Dubai simply means that whatever interests might be there from the British and other empires is going to also disappear as they become engaged in this global battle for Europe. So Dubai and the rest of the region goes back to being a forgotten part of the world as the world seems to move on somewhere else. The pearl crash triggered a famine, and malnourishment became widespread in Dubai in the 30s and 40s. The British, who remember, right, are protecting Dubai and the other regions, are now going to be even more aloof as they try to figure out how to survive World War II. And if there was anyone who could provide some kind of help during this difficult time, it would be the British. But they are no longer around. And Dubai went from selling food, trading it as the primary entrepreneur in the region, to simply looking for it. Bankruptcies tore through the economy. The Indian merchants themselves typically gathered their families and just simply went back to Bombay. I think we can imagine some Iranian merchants most likely did the same. Slavery is actually still present in the area, and many slaves deserted their masters who just simply could not afford to feed them. Any schools that had opened in Dubai in the early 1900s closed, and foreign teachers fled. This is a point in the history where the individuals who lived in Dubai were simply trying to survive on bugs and leaves and lizards. And of course, some of them starved to death. And in other parts of the region, those 7 regions we looked at earlier, the conditions were even tougher. They had less of an economy than Dubai had built in the early 1900s. The ruling family of the area, the Al Maktoum, are going to be challenged in the 1930s. There's actually going to be an uprising of sorts from the merchant class to replace the Al Maktoum. It will not succeed, so the Al Maktoum will remain in power, but just to show that the conditions were very tough. And for the merchants, they thought that perhaps the Al Maktoum could be doing something more. Not quite clear what that might be, but the tribal rule is going to be challenged in these difficult times, as we got to remember that the unspoken bargain in this area is that a tribal family rules the area in exchange for protection and prosperity. And as long as you're able to provide those, then there's no need for any kind of political rights. There's no need for elections or for voting. But if there's no prosperity, if there's no progress, then the citizens start to question the importance of the tribal family. For the people who live in Dubai, there was a very strong rejection of the poverty they now face themselves with again, right? They were trying to escape the poverty from the early 1900s, and now it has come back to their shores. So some reform of the government is attempted here in the 1930s. Again, it fails, but we can argue that the legacy of this movement is going to be reflected in the DNA of Dubai. We're going to see a Dubai that's going to cater very heavily to merchants. Today, of course, we don't call them merchants. We might just call them business people. But this is going to be a significant element in how Dubai thinks about strategy and how it thinks about growth. How does it build the commerce part of the region and allow merchants to thrive? And what does that look like? So the reforms may fail from a political standpoint, but they will not be forgotten by the Al Maktoum family. Dubai is going to continue to linger in these difficult economic conditions. There's going to be some minor improvements after World War II, but really a story is going to begin in the 50s, right? We're going to pick up where Dubai is right now as it tries to become this entreport. And we're going to pick it up as a new leader, a new member of the Al Maktoum family will come into power officially in 1958. that is the end of episode 1 of 3 episodes on the Dubai series. I hope you have enjoyed the story so far. We are leaving Dubai in a bit of a tough spot, in the difficult conditions post the stock market crash, the Great Depression, and of course the collapse of the pearl industry. Episode 2, which will be released next week, is going to pick up the story with a new character. A new member of the Al Maktoum family, Sheikh Rashid, is going to take power, and he will start a quest for new pearls in a new way to modernize Dubai. My name is Ruben Ugarte. I'll see you next week.